You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Some of these questions seem to be jokes, and they answer them in a jocular fashion. When a man writes in and says, there's various women, I have these choices, who should I pick? They tell him not to marry the smartest one or the wittiest one because she will put him down all the time. And if there's nothing to divide these two women up other than their size, marry the smaller one because her clothes will be less expensive.
And welcome to episode 410 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When do people begin seeking anonymous advice for their most profound personal dilemmas? And what can the answers to their early questions tell us about the emotional lives of people in the past? Today, we're traveling back in time to 1690s England to explore the world's first personal advice column, the Athenian Mercury. This two-sided broadsheet publication invited readers to send in questions about anything, from science and religion to love and marriage, and its creators, a small group of Londoners who dubbed themselves the Athenian Society, answered these queries with a surprising blend of wit, morality, and insight. Joining us for this investigation is Mary Beth Norton, a good friend of this podcast and an award-winning historian and trailblazer in the field of early American women's history. Now, you may remember Mary Beth from our conversations in episode 112 and 294, where we discussed the fourth tea ship of Boston and her book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Today, Mary Beth joins us to share her latest work, an edited volume, titled, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, Letters on Love and Marriage from the World's First Personal Advice Column. Needless to say, we're going to have a fun conversation. Now, during our investigation of love and marriage in late 17th century English society, Mary Beth reveals why the 1690s were ripe for the invention of a personal advice column, what readers' anonymous questions tell us about gender, love, marriage, and courtship in the late 17th century, and how the Athenian 17th century advice echoes many of the same concerns that we still write to columnists about today. But first, Ben Franklin's World now has a regular email newsletter. Each week, I look at the headlines and issues of today and relate them to similar events and lessons from the early American past. I've even added a short PS section at the end of the newsletter where I share a little bit about what's going on in my life during the week. For example, in one newsletter, I shared cute photos of my assistant pod dogs, Cleo and Orbit. So if you'd like to have a little bit more history in your life and see more behind the scenes of this podcast, sign up for the newsletter, benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. Okay, are you ready to investigate the world's first personal advice column? Allow me to reintroduce you to our guest, Mary Beth Norton. Our guest is the Mary Donlin Alger Professor Emerita at Cornell University. She's an award-winning historian who has served as the president of the American Historical Association, and she's a pioneer in the field of women's history. You may remember our guest from episode 112 and 294, where we discussed her scholarship on the fourth tea ship of Boston and her book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Today, she joins us again to investigate her new edited volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, Letters on Love and Marriage from the World's First Personal Advice Column. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Mary Beth Norton.
Oh, I'm so glad to be talking with you again, Liz.
And we're happy to have you back to talk about, actually, pre-Ben Franklin's World, as Ben Franklin was born in 1706, and most of our topics today will be in the late 17th century.
Yes, and the world's first personal advice column is London in the 1690s.
Now, before we dive into that column, I wonder if we could talk about your new edited volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, because it's a volume that provides us with a glimpse not only at the world's first personal advice column, but also of 17th century English love and marriage culture. So Mary Beth, would you tell us how you found this advice column and why, as a scholar of early America, you decided to research this period of early modern England?
I actually first encountered the printer, John Dunton, who was the man who started the whole thing, when I was working on my book on the Salem witch trials. because John Dunton was the printer for Cotton Mather's and Increase Mather's materials in London when they were English editions of their work on witchcraft. So I already knew his name when I encountered this publication, the Athenian Mercury. And I encountered the Athenian Mercury when I was working on my book, Separated by Their Sex, Women in the Colonial Atlantic World. I wanted to know about the transatlantic life of women. And I think one of the things I've learned is that, especially in the 17th century, we need to think about the Atlantic Ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. It was the connection between England and America, and people traveled it all the time. People went back and forth, and ideas went back and forth. And even though the Athenian Mercury was published in London, there are occasional references to American events in it. Dunton, in particular, because he had traveled himself to New England previously, a few years earlier, he was interested in what was going on in New England, and he occasionally ran stories about New England in the Athenian Mercury. And there was a couple of references, just in passing, to people in Maryland reading the Athenian Mercury. So you might ask, what was the Athenian Mercury? The Athenian Mercury was a broadsheet publication thought up by John Dunton. It was a one-page, two-sided sheet with questions and answers. Another way of thinking about it is Google for the 17th century, or Wikipedia, because John Dunton's idea was to have a question and answer format where men who sat around in coffee houses and talked about many different topics could have their questions answered when nobody knew the answer to something when a conversation came up. So the idea was that they would write questions to the Athenian Mercury, and the Athenian Mercury experts, that was basically Dunton and his two brothers-in-law, would answer the questions. And they called themselves the Athenian Society, and they claimed to be a large group of experts, but it was really three guys. And they hid that fact for quite a long time. There's a very amusing print that was published to show, supposedly, the Athenian Society and the people asking them questions use it as an illustration in my book. It's very, very funny because it shows this bewigged group of guys, there might be 10 or 12 guys, sitting behind a dais, and then all these people down below holding up questions, written questions for the guys. And that's actually on the book cover. It's great.
It's really neat to think about how you found John Dunton and his publication, because, as you noted, the Atlantic world is a world. And even in the late 17th century, people, ideas, fashion, material culture, and publications, they were all going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And this publication pretty much highlights that. Now, as you mentioned in your book, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, John Dunton's idea for an advice column was truly new and novel in the 1690s. No one had ever published this sort of publication before, so it is the world's first personal advice column. And I think that may seem strange to us because we've always lived in a world where we could write Dear Abby or some other advice columnist to ask personal questions where we fear if we asked them of friends and family, we would be truly embarrassed.
Right.
So Mary Beth, while you were conducting your research, did you find out how John Dunton came up with this really fresh and novel idea?
He tells us in his autobiography that he was walking in the park one day with a friend when he suddenly got the idea for this periodical publication that would be simply questions and answers. And although he doesn't say it explicitly, I know that he hung out in coffee houses, and I suspect he'd just come out of a coffee house conversation with friends where questions had come up that no one could answer. So he thought, I will solve this problem by making this quick, cheap publication that people can write to and get an immediate answer, immediate in these times being 2 or 3 days later when the next issue came out, to these questions. And I also think to myself what those conversations must have been like in the coffee houses. What if you were somebody sitting in a coffee house and astronomy came up as an issue and you realize that you don't know whether the Earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the Earth, and you're embarrassed to ask that question because people would know that you're stupid and you don't know the answer. So what you can do because of the Athenian Mercury is you can write that question to the Athenian Mercury and they will answer, because all the questions and answers are anonymous. Now, what's really interesting to me about the Athenian Mercury becoming the world's first personal advice column, it's not as though there's a column specifically, it's just all the questions and answers in this two-sided, one-page journal, which comes out twice a week for 6 years, that it's the readers themselves that wanted personal advice. Dunton and his brothers-in-law didn't intend to answer these kinds of questions. That's very clear. They were interested in questions about religion and science. One of them was a minister, one of them was a scientist. Dunton was very eclectic with his interests. And so they really thought of themselves, as I said, Wikipedia for the 17th century. And what happened, though, was about 6 weeks in, after 12 or 13 issues, they got a list of questions as from a man that were general personal advice. They weren't real personal, but they were things like, don't people marry too young these days? Or isn't it true that more people marry for money rather than love? Isn't that a bad idea? So that kind of thing. So they answer those questions. And in the very same issue, they say they have a letter from a lady in the country. This is astonishing because only men hung out in coffee houses, and the journal was being distributed only in London. And so how did this lady in the country get her hand on it? But in any event, she got her hand on it and she wrote to them at the coffee house address. I should say that the address they gave for the letters was a coffee house. It wasn't the print shop. It was a coffee house. So nobody knew who was printing it. In fact, Dunton, this is a digression, but Dunton printed it under a false name for a while. So she asked, can ladies ask questions as well as gentlemen? And they say, why, yeah, even though they clearly never thought of this. So then she writes in, or another woman writes in another week or two with the same kind of general questions that the first guy asked. And then after a few weeks, it's still a few weeks, it's not immediate, people start asking other kinds of really what I would call genuinely personal questions, not just how do I generally behave when I'm courting somebody, but what should I do when I really want to kiss this woman and I'm afraid she won't be happy about that?
Well, I know we want to dig into the questions that people were asking the Athenian Society, but first, would you set the scene for us so that we can better understand the world and context from which these people were posing their questions? What was English society like by the 1690s?
Well, remember, the 1690s just follows the Glorious Revolution, and the Glorious Revolution follows the English Civil War, which has gone on since the 1640s. And it includes the interregnum period where Cromwell ruled England, and then the restoration of the Stuart monarchy and the overthrow of the Catholic Stuarts in exchange for the Protestants, William and Mary. So it's a period of great political turmoil. We're ending a lot of political turmoil. And Queen Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II, who'd been ousted from the throne, made it her personal responsibility or her personal crusade to start a society for the reparation of manners. She felt clearly that life, especially under the Restoration, had gotten too out of hand, that they were concerned about clandestine marriage, they were concerned about immorality in general. And so her Society for the Reformation of Manners aimed at reforming things, and that was part of the agenda of the Athenians. They are very moral in their responses to questions, and they have to stay away from politics, I might add. They got themselves into big trouble one time when they answered a question that they shouldn't have answered, and they got suspended by the censor for several months because there was official censorship at this point until 1695. After 1695, Parliament repealed the censorship law, which went back to the 1640s. So they were able to publish anything, but they still didn't talk about politics. I mean, basically, they said to their readers, we will answer questions on anything, just not politics. So there were people wrote in and said, why are you answering questions about these stupid personal problems? Aren't you ruining your reputation as scholars and experts on all these major topics? And they said, well, the society is based on families and how families operate. is crucial to the success of the Commonwealth. And so we need to continue to answer these questions. In fact, people did write in and say, you shouldn't be answering stupid questions from women. Only talk to men. And they said, no, women are important to the health of families. So they prided themselves, and Dunton himself prided himself on being very much in favor of female equality. It would not be equality in the same way we see it, but certainly the way they set themselves up, let's put it this way, they seem to be less misogynistic than other guys in their time. And they pride themselves on that.
And speaking of who the Athenians thought they were speaking to, Travis and Lydia would like to know more about the target audience for the Athenian Mercury. So who did the Athenians think they were writing to, and who was actually reading the Athenian Mercury?
The initial publication is aimed at guys who sit around in coffee houses. There is no question about that. That's the idea behind it. And who are the guys who sit around in coffee houses? There seem to be mostly young men who chat with their friends over coffee. And then it broadens to include women who are connected to these young men. Now, there is an argument in the scholarship about whether women hung out in coffee houses too. It seems to have been unlikely that they were there, except as workers. We do have one very nice print of the time of men in a coffee house having their conversations, looking at newspapers, talking, and two guys actually fighting. But in the background, there's a woman who's managing the coffee. But that's it. She's the only woman in the room. I now believe that women really weren't there. But women were getting access to this publication because the pages were sold on the streets of London by the vendors who managed newspapers. They were called Mercury Women. They shared their name in part with the Athenian Mercury. So you could buy on a street of London one of these pages. Now, if you wanted to sit around and talk about them, you would probably want to be in a coffee house because John Dunton, who was an entrepreneurial type, he wouldn't have started this otherwise. After about 20 issues, sometimes it was different, but after about 20 issues, he would bind them together in a big volume, and they are big, heavy volumes, and sell them to the coffee house owners for 2 shillings, 6pence. And that was about $35 at the time, $35 in 2020 when I checked the monetary equivalent of this. Then the coffee house owners would buy these books, which would have indexes so that guys who were sitting around in the coffee house could not only just flip the pages, but could look into an index. And the index would say, question on astronomy or on some other kind of science or on religion. There were lots of religion questions, which is not surprising given the fact that we've had the change from Catholicism to Protestantism, back to Catholicism, back to Protestantism. It's obvious that there would be a lot of questions about religion. So people in the coffee house could sit around and talk about these things. Now, the books, as far as I can figure out, were not sold on the streets, but the individual pages were, and they would cost about 1 penny. Again, the equivalent today would be something less than $1 for one of those sheets. So if you were walking along the street of London, if you were a woman or a man, you could buy one of these things. You could learn about the existence of this publication if you didn't know about it before. And then you could, if you had a question, write to the Athenian Society and get an answer or hope you got an answer. Now, one thing the guys complained about was that they were overloaded with questions. And occasionally there are questioners who say, I've written you several times before and never had an answer. So will you please answer the question this time? So how many times that happened, I have no clue, but there are questions that start that way.
Were these well-to-do young men, working-class men, the men who were hanging out in the coffee house?
They're pretty much middling guys. They're not well-to-do. The questions and answers usually use the words gentlemen and ladies, but from the content of the questions, we can learn that these are sort of normal, ordinary people. These are young men who are on the make. Some are aspiring apprentices. Some of the questions come from men who explicitly say, I'm an apprentice and I need advice about what to do next in my life. Should I get married? There's this woman who's out there and she has some money, but if I marry her, I will be giving up my apprenticeship. Should I continue the apprenticeship until I finish, or should I marry this woman with money? They usually say, by the way, finish your apprenticeship. Get your education first before you go off after somebody else. So sometimes people talk about inheritance, a set of the letters that I think come from families that are somewhat better off. But I would say we're mostly dealing with middling men and women who are aspirational, who hope to advance themselves in the world, and who see marriage and love as a part of that aspiration, establishing a family, establishing a stable home life, that sort of thing. There are a very few questions that come in from explicitly older people, really older people, like one guy who complains about his son who gets married without his permission, even though his son is already a widower and has had several children. But this old man, who's got to be old, basically says, this guy should have asked me for permission to get married, even though he's clearly an adult who's been married already.
Mary Beth, you know a lot about the different questions the Athenian Mercury's readers posed. Did John Dunton leave you and other historians a box of papers that included all the different questions and letters that people wrote in to the Athenians?
No.
Or did you have to sit down and read every issue of this publication to determine what people were asking them?
I was just reading the issues. Dunton has papers that survive. They are at the Bodley Library in Oxford, and I did go and look at them. But alas, none of the letters that are these kinds of questions survive. None of those survive. There is correspondence with some people that survive, but they're not questions. And they're actually letters from women. The publication was very popular among women, it seems, because Dunton did praise women's intellect, and he did argue for women's education and things like that in letters that I don't talk about at all in this book, but which I do talk about in the other book, Separated by Their Sex. So he promoted the careers of certain women writers, especially later in the existence of the journal in the later 1690s. He particularly liked the writing of a poet named Elizabeth Singer Rowe. He really liked her work, and he would publish her poems and so forth in the Athenian Mercury. So anyway, what can I say about Dunton? I just find him a really fascinating guy in general. He publishes a lot. He claimed toward the end of his life that he'd published more than 500 books. That seems to be too many, but he did publish a lot. And there has been scholarship about him. In fact, there's a biography of him called The Oracle of the Coffee House, which tells you something about what his image is. The Athenian Mercury was his most popular and successful publication. He actually died bankrupt, and he died after several stints in debtor's prison. So it's clear from the evidence that his first wife managed his estates very well. And after she died, his finances really fell apart. And that's when the Athenian Mercury stops also. And then he married a second time, and he married for money, which was interesting because the Athenians always told people, do not marry for money. But he did. And his second wife's mother realized that he had married her for money. And that was the end of the gravy train as far as John Dunton was concerned. So that's when he went bankrupt the first time. One of the things that we haven't talked about is the fact that, in part because he went bankrupt, he sold the copyright to the Athenian Mercury publication to another man, a man named Andrew Bell. And Andrew Bell put out a 3-volume edition of the letters, not all of them, obviously, but a selection of the letters under the title The Athenian Oracle, with the subtitle Letters from the Old Athenian Mercuries. And this came out in 1703, 1704, and then ultimately was reprinted numerous times. It was a very popular book. And one of the things I discovered is that it was sold in the colonies. So it's not entirely clear how many people in the colonies knew about the Athenian Mercury in the 1690s when it was being published. But the Athenian Oracle became quite popular in the colonies as something to read and purchase in the later 18th century. I found book ads in the American newspapers, thanks to the database that I could keyword search for Athenian Oracle. I found book ads to sell the Athenian Oracle all the way from 1722 in the New England Current to the 1790s. There's also, interestingly enough, a published lending list or library list from a library in Pennsylvania, just a little town in Pennsylvania, that covers the 1760s through the 1770s. And it shows a copy of the Athenian Oracle being checked out repeatedly. So these questions and answers that were written in the 1690s were clearly regarded as being relevant in the 18th century colonies. And one final thing I will say is that one of the things I discovered is that Benjamin Franklin himself advertised copies for sale of the Athenian Oracle in 1747, 1748 in his Pennsylvania Gazette. So did those books sell? I don't know. One of the funny things was in 1769, the Library Company of Philadelphia decided to sell some of its books. And one of the books it decided to sell was the Athenian Oracle. So maybe by 1769, demand had kind of dropped off.
As a historian with a great curiosity, you have a lot of different interests, so I can see exactly why this project was so fun for you, Mary Beth, because a lot of different topics is exactly what you found in the questions and answers of the Athenian Mercury. But in your volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, you focus specifically on questions from readers about love, courtship, and marriage. What about those subjects captivate your interest?
Well, of course, they involved women in ways that the other letters didn't. But in addition, if I'd focused on other topics, it would have been more about the Athenian Mercury. I was not interested in the Athenian Mercury as a periodical. There is a good book, actually, that was written by Helen Berry, who's a British literature specialist, about gender and the Athenian Mercury. And it was one of the first things that I read about the Athenian Mercury that helped introduce me to it. I mean, I told you I was introduced to Dunton in other ways, but I was introduced to the Athenian Mercury in part by Helen Berry's book. It's one of the things that got me very intrigued about writing about the Athenian Mercury in my previous book, Separated by Their Sex, because the whole argument of separated by their sex has to do with how did, quote, modern ideas of sexual difference, gender difference, develop in the early 18th century in the colonies as well as in England. The other questions were interesting generally, but what I really was fascinated with, the letters on courtship and marriage, because, of course, those are the letters that are like the ones that we read today, or sort of like the ones we read today, but with 17th century embellishments, shall we say. And the other letters are letters that today we would have answers for, like what causes smallpox or something else along those lines. There are questions that are interesting in the context of science and religion and so forth in their time. But to me, what was really fascinating was how many of the letters that I was reading, love and marriage, related to things we might read today in advice columns.
Yeah, I noticed those similarities too as I read I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, because even though 17th century English is a bit different from 21st century English, I could imagine someone asking very similar questions today with modern phrases. Now, speaking of the questions people asked, questions posed about courtship often included requests for advice on how can I let the man or woman know that I really like them? Is it appropriate for me to propose marriage without getting parents' permission? Can I kiss someone during courtship? Mary Beth, as we're going to talk more about love, marriage, and courtship, would you tell us about courtship rituals in late 17th century England?
Well, one of the crucial things was, you've just mentioned it briefly, and that's the need for parental consent. That's one thing that's quite different from today. The Athenians believed that people should not marry without the consent of their parents if they were financially dependent on their parents. Now, they did make some exceptions for people who'd been out on their own for a while, economically, financially, but they mostly thought that it was appropriate for people to ask consent of their parents. And this was regarded as almost a legal requirement that you get your parents to consent to your marriage. One of the things that these courting couples are very concerned about is dealing with parents who are not very happy, say, with the choice that the young man or the young woman has made. And sometimes, especially with young women, trying to force that young person to marry someone they don't really want to marry. And so that's part of the questions that you read is, I'm a young woman, I've always been dutiful to my parents, and yet they now want me to marry somebody that I don't want to marry. I'm much more interested in this other guy. How do I navigate this? So the Athenians give very interesting advice. One of the pieces of advice that they like to give is, if you can't get your parents to agree to your marriage, wait till they die, and then you can marry whoever you want. And of course, that has to do with expectations about life expectancy at the time. But they also sometimes give young people suggestions about how they can possibly persuade their parents to do what they really want their parents to agree to do. And they do say definitively, and they say it several times, I might say I did not publish all these letters because they are repetitive. They do say several times children are not like cattle. They can't be bossed around like livestock, and your parents cannot force you to marry anybody you don't want to. They walked a fine line. You need your parents' consent, preferably to marry the person you want to marry, but they can't force you to marry someone you don't want to marry. And you're better off remaining single than marrying someone who will make you miserable, which I think is pretty good advice today.
Speaking to this idea of parental consent, you mentioned that there was an older man who wrote into the Athenians, and he was all mad because his son didn't ask for permission to marry, even though his son was a widower with several children. Was there ever an expiration date on the need for parental consent to marry? Did you need to ask for permission even after you reached the age of majority, which I think is around 21?
Well, as far as that guy was concerned, no, he thought it didn't matter. The Athenians say nobody should get married before the age of 25. And young people do write in who are younger than 25. And basically, sometimes the Athenians say, at least wait until you turn 25 or wait until you reach your full majority. They don't always say 25, but it's clear that that's what they mean. They do think that people do marry too young and that you should be a little bit older by the time you marry. And they don't see any problem in waiting. Sometimes these young people will write in and say, it's urgent. I have to make a decision. Do I marry this person or that person? And they will say, wait, it's better off to take a breath and not decide now. So I think that's pretty good advice, too. They do emphasize being at least 21, which is the age of inheritance. And then, as far as they're concerned, for marriage, 25 is better.
What about courtship in this period? Many of us may watch Bridgerton on HBO, which takes place about 100 years after the Athenian Mercury was published, and it involves courtship rituals among the English nobility, who are hopefully setting the tone for courtship among members of broader English society. So it's a little bit different. But in this series, you can see that courting men and women, they're rarely allowed to spend any time alone together. Women in particular were often required to have a servant, a friend, or family member accompany them when they go out on dates with the pursuing gentleman. Were everyday men and women who courted each other during the late 17th century, were they allowed to spend any time alone together as they courted? Or how did their courtship rituals work?
Yeah, well, men and women clearly spent time alone because the women sometimes complain of getting pregnant, or the men complain that the woman's gotten pregnant. So, yeah, they clearly spend time alone. With this kind of middling society, you don't have that sort of social control that you have later on. There are some letters that talk about groups of young people together, but not always in positive ways. There's one that specifically talks about a young woman getting clearly drugged by this guy who then leads her out of the room to do what? We don't know. So it's not always positive that there are groups of people together, but they clearly do spend time together alone. Both men and women talk about that. The women talk sufficiently often. Now, of course, these are the women with problems. The women talk sufficiently often about either seductions or attempted seductions that you realize they had to have been alone. They couldn't have been in a group.
That's something else I really appreciated about your volume. I humbly beg your speedy answer as well, because you did include both questions and answers where we can laugh because the people pose their questions. They were light, they're humorous, they were meant to be laughed at. And yet you also include serious questions and answers that make us think about serious problems like date rape and drugs.
Yes, there is a letter where a guy basically admits to raping a woman. And he feels very remorseful about it and asks the Athenians for how he can propitiate the problem. Now, as far as the Athenians are concerned, they actually see her as guilty too, because she agreed in some way. So she too, they think, needs to do penance of some kind. As I said, they're very moral, and sometimes they basically tell young people, their questioners who have done bad things, to go to church more often, to do penance, and so forth. There's a young woman who writes in and talks about how she basically had sex before marriage with some other guy, and now she's married, and she says to the Athenians, I managed things so that my husband doesn't know. So obviously, she basically convinced her husband that she was a virgin on the night that they married. But she says, I am consumed by guilt. and I don't know how to deal with this. Can you help me? I'm wasting away to a skeleton because I'm just not eating. And I feel so guilty about what I did to my husband. And they say, well, you should clearly have married the guy you had sex with the first time. That, by the way, was always their advice. Marry whoever you have sex with the first time. But they then say, but you don't owe an apology to anyone on earth. You don't need to tell your husband. Just be religious, go to church, do penance, and so forth. Apologize to God. That's your penalty, as it were. There's a guy who actually talks about having a long-standing affair with a married woman. And what should he do? Because he wants to get out of it. And he clearly would like to apologize to the husband, but he doesn't want to get the woman into more trouble. And so basically, again, they tell him he doesn't owe anything to anyone on earth, only owes things to God in heaven.
Now, one of the questions you included in your volume is from a young woman. Quote, a young woman growing into years wishes to know what she shall do to get her a good husband, end quote. And the Athenians replied, quote, we answer briefly, go to the colonies, or send her name to us, nor can we think of any other remedy, end quote. Mary Beth, why don't we take a moment for our episode sponsor, and then I wonder if you would help us parse this 17th century question and answer and explain what it meant to grow old and why the Athenians' advice was to search for a good husband in the colonies. Mary Beth, would you help us parse this 17th century question and answer and explain what it meant to grow old in the late 17th century and why the Athenians' advice to this woman was to search for a good husband in the colonies?
Yeah, well, what she's talking about when she says growing into years, I read that as I'm probably getting close to 20, 21, something like that, which is seen as a marriageable age. But the advice to go to the colonies is not unique to that letter. There's at least one other letter where they tell the woman to go to the colonies. In that letter, they say, go where there are the fewest women, and you will find a husband more easily. And they were right. I know from my work in my book, Founding Mothers and Fathers, that there were single women who went to the colonies specifically to find husbands. So it was not bad advice. Now, that part about send us your name, they allude on other occasions, they kind of would run a personals column if people wanted them to. They would run names of people who were interested in finding partners, although as far as I could tell, nobody ever took them up on it. They do claim not just to that woman, but to others, to a man at one occasion, that we'll run your name and we'll see if we can find a partner for you.
And what about finding a good husband? What were English women in the late 17th century looking for in a good husband?
It's interesting. The women who write in are clearly looking for affection. There's no question about that. And they're also looking for economic stability, which is not surprising given the middling origin of these people. Yeah, they want financial stability. They don't necessarily want wealth. There aren't people who write in and say, I'm looking for the richest person I can find. Or I shouldn't say that. Nobody writes in and says that, because there are a couple people who say that, more or less. And should I marry this person with this amount of money or that person with a lesser amount of money who has the following qualities? And the Athenians always say, marry the person with the lesser amount of money who has the better qualities. Some of these questions seem to be jokes, and they answer them in a jocular fashion. There's one where a woman writes in and says, there's this sort of dull poet who writes me poems, and I don't want to marry him. He's a drudge. Now, a writer is a drudge. And of course, she's writing to writers. And so that's part of the fun. And then she says, there's this dull guy and that dull guy and this old lech. And which of these do I pick? I have to marry one of them. So they run through all these characteristics. And it's very funny, actually. It's a very funny letter. And they basically tell her, marry the solid businessman who will support her properly. But when a man writes in and says, there's various women, I have these choices, who should I pick? They tell him not to marry the smartest one or the wittiest one because she will put him down all the time. And if there's nothing to divide these two women up other than their size, marry the smaller one because her clothes will be less expensive. So occasionally they do tell jokes. And they recognize that the letters written into them are jokes. There's one very funny letter that comes in where it's clearly done by a bunch of friends of a particular young man. They describe the young man as having this, that, and the other thing, and a great head of hair. And how can he find a wife? And so the Athenians respond in similar fashion. It's clear that this guy is not lacking in all these great qualities. And so they show they know the whole thing is a joke. Let's put it that way. So it's very funny.
Well, while we're on this subject of comparing answers that they gave to men and women, I am curious if you noticed any difference in how the Athenians answered questions from men versus questions from women. Because as I was reading I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, I was trying to read whether they were taking some women seriously or whether they really knew that they could poke fun at them.
I think mostly they were. I actually give them a lot of credit. As I said earlier, they pride themselves as being less misogynistic than other people at the time, and they are. They are genuinely less misogynistic. I didn't notice that much difference. They condemn both men and women for bad sexual behavior. There's a unique 3-letter sequence that I use that is remarkable. It is unique. There's nothing else like it that I found. A woman writes in using poor spelling and poor grammar. And the fact that they print it that way makes me realize that they must have edited other letters. Because here's what happens. Using poor grammar and poor spelling, she writes in and she says she's miserable. She's had a child 3 years ago with a young man who she loves desperately. And he basically is, well, she says slighting. We would say ghosting. He's ghosting her. And what is she going to do? She is thinking about committing suicide. She is so desperate. So they write back and they really excoriate her. And they say, we can tell the kind of person you are by your terrible grammar and spelling. They basically say, live your life in penitence. So they're very unsympathetic. But exactly a week later, in the next issue, they run the same letter again, but this time edited with proper grammar and proper spelling with a different answer. So I think either one of them wrote that first answer and the others were not happy with it, or the readers were not happy with it. Sometimes we know from current personal advice columns that readers write in and they don't like the advice that the person has given. So they clearly got feedback on the first response, and people, I think, thought it was too harsh. So in the second answer, they're much more sympathetic to her. And they say, basically, the guy's a jerk. Cut him out of your life. Live without him, blah, blah. So that is interesting enough, because there are other times when I do find them as changing their minds. But in this particular case, it was within 1 week. But then 2 weeks later, the guy writes in and he says, I am the unhappy man. And he reveals that basically the problem is he really loves this woman. He wants to marry her. His parents will not let him marry her. His parents say it will drive them to their graves if he marries her. And so he's hung up. He says he really wants to be with her. He wants to be a father to their child and so forth. And this time they basically say, you know what? You're married by all intents and purposes. Forget your parents. Act as though you're married. And by the way, let us know how this story comes out. And then we never hear anything else. But they actually become very sympathetic to the young couple's problems once it becomes clear that it's not the guy who's the jerk, it's his parents who are causing the problem.
Now, what happened when couples in the 1690s found a good match? They found their good wives, they found their good husbands. How did they go about getting married? And what was the institution of marriage like in the 1690s?
Well, it was kind of tricky, actually, because there was no legal definition of marriage in England until 1753, which is 60 years later. So because there was no law passed by Parliament that said what marriage was, people actually differed in their ideas of what constituted a marriage. The church said that you had to be married publicly in a church by a clergyman. But clearly, that often didn't happen. And there were people who regarded themselves as married who didn't go through what we might call today a marriage ceremony. So the Athenians at one point refer to the marriage by the law of God, marriage by the law of nature, and marriage by the law of the land. And those three things are different because by the law of nature, what they mean is someone who is past puberty and is sexually mature. Because there are a couple of occasions when people ask them about child marriages. So it's tricky. There are people who write in and they don't know who they're married to, or they don't understand what the rules are, because the church put great emphasis, in addition to wanting people to be actually married in church by a clergyman, they put great emphasis on vows and promises made by the young couple to each other. And so there are many young people who write in and say, well, I did vow to marry this person faithfully. And we even broke a piece of money, which, by the way, was a form of folk marriage that I had discovered in my previous work on 17th century America. Breaking a piece of money with your beloved was a sign of marriage. And then somebody wants to get out of it. And sometimes both of them want to get out of it. And then the question is, how do we deal with that? We made these faithful promises to each other, or I made this faithful promise to this person. I've now changed my mind. I've got a better offer, or I'm more attracted to this other person, or something like that. So the Athenians usually said, if the courtship had gone on long enough that it was very serious, even if there were no formal vows like that, it was only fair for the person who wanted out to get formal release from the other person. And then this applied to both men and women. If a woman wanted to get out, she had to get the man to release her. If a man wanted to get out, he had to get the woman to release him. And they often added, and by the way, we think that no rational person would refuse such a request, because why would you want to be married to somebody who doesn't want to be married to you? So they actually thought that, I think, people could get released from these vows. But it becomes very clear to me from these questions that there were many young people who made these kind of faithful vows to each other, usually sometimes when they're very young. Some of them talk about being teenagers, and then they change their minds, or one of them changes their minds, or the parents don't like the idea, and then the whole thing has to change.
What if you are the product of a young marriage and you found that your marriage just wasn't working for you, or perhaps you're a bit older and what worked for you when you were younger is no longer working for you and your partner when you're a bit older? Did married couples have any recourse through divorce in the 1690s?
Yeah, there is no real divorce. I mean, the only way you can get divorced is through an act of parliament. And these were people who couldn't go to parliament to get a divorce. So they could go to the ecclesiastical court, not the civil court, but the ecclesiastical court, and ask for a divorce from bed and board, which is basically a separation agreement. But that couldn't happen unless you had really clear evidence of adultery, which was very hard to come by. And there were people who wrote into the Athenians who said, I do have this evidence. What should I do? And they say, you've got to go to the ecclesiastical court. But even if the ecclesiastical court gave them a divorce from bed and board, that is, would give financial support to the woman, basically, usually under those circumstances, neither party could remarry as long as the other one lived. Divorce, as it were, that kind of semi-divorce, did not bring with it permission to remarry. And there were a number of people who wrote into the Athenians, both men and women, who'd been married once, that marriage wasn't working out or hadn't worked out. It was now over with. I remember one guy who writes in and says, it's basically been 7 years since my wife left me, and now I want to remarry. How do I do that? And they basically say, you can't do that. So the guy goes off. Actually, there's other situations like this I've seen. He finds a new partner, and she and he pledge to each other to be faithful. So they basically act as though they're married. Sometimes there's men who are described in these letters as having presented a woman as his wife, but she's really not his wife, technically. And isn't this okay? Because we've promised to be faithful. We promised before God. And isn't the marriage before God the crucial thing, not the marriage in the church? And usually the Athenians say the marriage in the church is really important. But as I said, in that one case of the young people whose parents were preventing the marriage, basically they said, forget the marriage in the church, forget the parents, you're married. And so there is this real issue at the time. What is sufficient for marriage? And so some of the issues that come up in the letters are, well, we never had sex. Even though we technically were married, we actually never went to bed together. So am I really married to this guy or this woman? And those questions were things that were trickier to deal with. And that's when they start to talk about marriage by the law of God and marriage by the law of the land.
Mary Beth, you read a lot of different questions and answers from the Athenian Mercury. And I think what we'd like to know is, what question or answer intrigued you most, or which question and answer just made you laugh?
Well, I would say the funniest letter, and it was very funny, was a guy who wrote in and said, I have red hair, but I love a woman who hates red hair. So what can I do? Can you direct me to someone who can dye my hair permanently so that she will never know I have red hair? He basically is afraid to approach her because he knows she doesn't like red hair. So he wants to have brown or black hair. So the Athenians actually say, why don't you just shave your head and wear a wig? Which, of course, men did at that time. And what was really funny is in the next issue, there's a little advertisement at the bottom of the page, which says, this woman, having read this question and answer, wants to announce that she can dye this guy's hair brown or black, whichever he prefers. And here's her address. Here's how to contact her. Because there were these little ads that ran at the bottom of the second page. Usually they just advertised John Dunton's publications. Usually they weren't terribly interesting ads. But this one was great because she basically was trying to get the guy's business by telling him that she can dye his hair brown or black and that it will last through washing for at least 2 weeks, which is what he's asking for. Very funny.
Before we move into the time warp, what do you hope readers of I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer will take away from this volume? Is there a particular lesson or insight that you hope we'll walk away with?
I would say only that sort of the more times change, the more things stay the same, because so many of the kinds of questions, even with these very explicit 17th century problems like a lack of divorce and so forth, even though those are there, they really are very similar to the kinds of problems you see in current issues, in current questions, like problems with in-laws, problems with parents, problems with spouses, and problems with knowing how to behave in a courtship. We don't have the same kinds of questions, but, when someone gets ghosted, they'll still write to an advice column to find out how to deal with that. And that's one of the things people do write to this column for people to write about. So they're not that different. But then there's the things that are very time-bound and very different, like the issues of divorce and parental consent and all these faithful vows that I don't know, maybe people make those kinds of vows to each other now, but I think they take them differently, shall we say.
Well, let's move into the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Mary Beth, in your opinion, what might have happened if the world's first personal advice column had originated in British North America instead of in England? What differences might we have seen in this hypothetical American version?
Well, I think that a lot of the questions would have been very similar because the context of the personal advice or of personal lives was very similar. But one thing that I think would have been different in the 1690s in particular was the fact of the presence of Native Americans in people's lives. This became obvious to me when I was working on my book on Salem witchcraft. And it's become obvious to me in things I've read about other areas of the colonies in the 1690s. It's a very turbulent time of relationships with Native Americans and the European settlers. And we're obviously dealing with small European settlements scattered along the coast in the context of Native American tribal customs. And I think we would have seen a lot of questions having to do with, shall we say, not diplomatic relations, then dealing with people of different backgrounds, which we don't see in the English questions coming from the coffeehouse set. And there probably would have been questions about people of African descent also. How do I deal with the enslaved people in my household or in someone else's household? I could see those questions coming too.
Yeah, and perhaps there also would have been questions about violence. We forget that early America was a very violent place.
Oh, yes.
And often experienced warfare.
Yes, absolutely. I think some of those questions would have had to do with violence. And indeed, there is a question in the Athenian Mercury, which I don't include because it's not one of these, but it's a question that John Dunton prints that has to do with the Indian War on the northern frontier in about 1694, I think. I'm trying to remember the exact date. I can't remember. But there is a question and answer in the Athenian Mercury about Indian relations in New England in the later 1690s.
Well, you've certainly written a lot of books over your career, and now that you've edited I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, what's next for you, Mary Beth?
Well, between books, I tend to do shorter issues and shorter projects. In this case, I actually have an edited project in mind, another edited project, but this is a different kind of project. It has to do with some letters of a loyalist woman in Massachusetts in the 1760s and 1770s. These are letters that I found when I was doing my doctoral dissertation all those years ago. And I have ascertained that they are available for publication. I want to edit and publish them through the website of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which is now publishing shorter things. They've traditionally published only big volumes. And this would be a shorter edition of her letters. And doing this basically in tribute to my dear friend Pauline Mayer, who we have talked about in Ben Franklin's World. Years ago, she was the chair of the publication committee of the Colonial Society. And she asked me, did I know of any women's documents, any women's letters that could be published? Because the Colonial Society had never published anything by women. And I immediately thought of this collection of letters that I had found long ago. So I now have a PDF. I've started doing a bit of editorial work on it. So it'll be a while. Don't anybody hold their breath. But at some point, I hope that the website of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts will include the papers of Christian Barnes of Marlborough, Massachusetts.
Sounds good. And we look forward to talking about Christian Barnes whenever you're ready.
That would be great.
Now, Mary Beth, we have a lot of questions all the time. So if we have more questions about love, marriage, and courtship in the late 17th century, where's the best place for us to send them to you?
The best place to contact me is just to email me at mbn1@cornell.edu. It's a very easy address, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it. And I hope that people enjoy reading the book. I enjoyed editing it. Your comment earlier, Liz, about the difficulties of reading 17th century prose made me think of the fact that I actually edited and modernized this prose greatly. So what you were reading was not, in many ways, exactly what was written in those letters. I mean, the content was the same. I kept as much phrasing as I could. But in the 17th century, they were fond of, for example, double negatives. And so I changed a lot of double negative sentences to positives. I changed words that are no longer in existence. I changed words that have changed their meaning. I shortened sentences. I left out a lot of material. There are lots of ellipses in here, both implicit and explicit. Sometimes the Athenians could be very long-winded, and they would have very long paragraphs that preceded their answers. I just omitted those, and I don't even have ellipses to show that for things that are before what I'm quoting. So everything is very much edited. There are no footnotes in this book, but there is, for every question and answer, an allied indication of where the original was, so that people who have access to the online versions, and there are a couple of online versions of the Athenian Mercury, or to the printed volumes, can find the original questions and answers if you want to find them.
And I agree. This is a highly readable volume, and Mary Beth even went so far as to provide context where she knows we're going to need it so that we can better understand the question and answer exchange. She even goes as far as defining words like slighting, which reminds us that that means the equivalent of ghosting in our own time. So I humbly beg your speedy answer is a highly readable volume.
Thanks. I wanted to make it that way, but I did want to retain the flavor of the language of the time. I didn't want to modernize it too much. But I actually did find, I'll tell you one thing, I found one word used in a letter that was not in the OED. I mean, the OED became my great go-to source as I was working on this, because many times I did have to look up usages to see what was going on. But I did find one word that was not in the OED, and I emailed the editors to tell them that, but I don't know whether they'll ever include it, but I gave them the exact reference. One thing I will say, too, I used the word friends. I didn't change it because they use the word friends to mean relatives and friends. So sometimes it's hard to differentiate. So I didn't try to do that. I just, whenever they used friends and it was clearly parents, I just kept friends. Many times people will say, my friends don't want me to marry. And what they mean is my parents don't want me to marry. Or my friends are giving me an inheritance. I'm relying on them, that sort of thing. So It's a very different kind of language, and I do explain that. And the word spark. The Athenians refer to some of these guys who are questionable in their courtship as sparks. Your spark. Or they'll call a guy a spark when he writes in, sparks like you, X. And they clearly disparage young men who they don't really trust.
Well, Mary Beth Norton, thank you for rejoining us and for introducing us to the world's first personal advice column.
I hope everybody enjoys it. Princeton University Press, published April 22nd, 2025.
What do the letters and advice printed in the Athenian Mercury reveal about life in English society during the late 17th century? As Mary Beth revealed, the advice people sought offers us a window into the hearts and minds of everyday people who grappled with timeless concerns: how to love, what makes a good match, how to obey their parents, when to obey their parents, and what to do when a relationship goes awry. We also find people who enjoyed a good sense of humor, experienced heartbreak, and asked for help with their moral reflection. And perhaps most compellingly of all, we find continuity. So many of the questions posed by everyday men and women in the 1690s could just as easily be emailed to an advice columnist in our own 21st century. As Mary Beth stated, the more things seem to change, the more people seem to stay the same. Mary Beth's edited volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, also reminds us of the power of reading across time and the importance of recognizing how print culture, gender norms, and Atlantic connections have helped shape people's personal lives. And this was long before the modern age of social media and advice programs. It's also a reminder that even across centuries and oceans, people have wrestled with the same hopes, fears, and feelings that we wrestle with today. And that curiosity and connection have always been part of what makes us human. Look for more information about Mary Beth, her edited volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/410. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. It's kind of like providing a lot of advice. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, people in the past wrestled with timeless concerns. So which of their questions and answers to the Athenian Society surprised you most? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.